I believe we are live. So I just would like to welcome everyone to Gramercy Books and an evening of poetry with two masters. We are here at the bookstore. I'm telling that to the online audience because we have a live audience here. And it's so great to see your faces. I'm sorry that we have to see a lot of them in masks now, but hopefully that will pass. But it's just great to be together. We're also thrilled to be joined by our online viewers tonight. Thanks to having Zoom. All of you here and online really are numbering almost 100 people. We already had some chat messages from people in Washington State and California. Outside of Central Ohio. Author programs of the past 16 months, and so we are very, very grateful for that. And know that we plan to mix it up going forward, always keeping everyone safe. So tonight we feature award-winning poet Maggie Smith as she launches her highly anticipatory new poetry collection, Goldenrod. Maggie will be joined all on cue. Maggie's going to be joined by fellow acclaimed poet, educator, and editor David Baker. There will be a wonderful conversation and readings ahead, and I'll introduce Maggie and David in just a moment. Goldenrod was released last Tuesday by Atria Books, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. And I want to have many, many thanks to Ohio State University's creative writing program, the Ohio Poetry Association, and Kenyon Review. Streaming this program through Zoom webinar for online viewers, and it will be recorded. And let me preview the next hour or so for you. After my introductions, Maggie and David will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. That will be followed by 15 minutes for your questions, to include both the in-person audience and online viewers, the latter submitting questions in the Q&A box, which we will be monitoring here in the bookstore. You'll find that icon for the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. You can write your questions in this box at any time during the program, and those questions, liked by many others, will be upvoted, which will mean they'll rise to the top and most likely be asked. Another tool is the chat box, and it allows you to chat. We hope that you online won't be chatting, since this is going to be really a wonderful conversation and readings that we're really looking forward to. But right now, do click on the chat box, online viewers, and it's going to open a column on the right of your screen. We've placed links for 3 upcoming author programs hosted by Gramercy Books, and you can click on any of these links to learn more. I encourage our in-store audience to make a mental note and check our website. It's www.gramercybooksbexley.com, and that'll have information about these that I'm going to mention and other exciting programs that we have ahead. They're all at 7 p.m. On Monday, August 23rd, we host our next Gramercy Book Club featuring Damnation Spring, an epic and immersive story and a compassionate portrait of a Pacific Northwest logging town clinging to a vanishing way of life amid an environmental threat. This essential novel for our time is a powerful debut by author Ash Davidson, who will join participants after the discussion of her novel, led by Kenyon Review editor Nicole Dutton, and that book just came out today. On September 13th, Gramercy Book Club features We Are the Brennans. Tracy Lang's impressive debut novel, also out today, explores the staying power of shame and the redemptive power of love in an Irish Catholic family torn apart by secrets. Sharing Tracy's Irish heritage, and the moderator for this program is Jim Phelan, Ohio State English professor and director of the university's esteemed Project Narrative. And finally, on September 22nd, John Thorndike, author of The Last of His Mind, A Year in the Shadow of Alzheimer's, shares the bittersweet account of his final year with his father, Joe, the former managing editor of Life magazine. John's memoir is a powerful portrait of deep family ties, caregiving, and love. And now, let's welcome tonight's featured guests. In Goldenrod, we have a stunning poetry collection, and it celebrates the beauty and messiness of life. Time magazine wrote that, quote, "To read Maggie Smith is to embrace the achingly precious beauty of the present moment." The poems in Goldenrod celebrate the contours of daily life, bringing us closer to that universal truth we're looking for. In motherhood and divorce, in love and pain, Maggie shows us how to find meaning in that space between good and bad. Maggie Smith is the award-winning author of several books of poetry, including Good Bones, The Well Speaks of Its Own Poison, Lamp of the Body, The List of Dangers, and Nesting Dolls. A 2011 recipient of a creative writing fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, Maggie has also received several individual excellence awards from the Ohio Arts Council, 2 Academy of American Poets prizes, a Pushcart Prize, and fellowships from the Sustainable Arts Foundation and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She has been widely published, appearing in, among others, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Tin House, the Gettysburg Review, and the Southern Review. In honor of Maggie's great contribution to literature and as Bexley's favorite daughter, we have a display of some of Maggie's most beloved books here at Gramercy, and you can see that by the checkout counter. Maggie, it's a thrill to welcome you back tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your new collection with in-store and virtual community. In conversation with Maggie is David Baker. David is an educator, an editor, a literary critic, and one of contemporary poetry's most gifted lyric poets. His most recent is Swift, New and Selected Poems. David has authored 12 books of poetry, as well as 6 books of prose. His forthcoming Whale Fall will be out in 2022. We're really excited about that. And among his awards are prizes and grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, Poetry Society of America, Mellon Foundation, and the Society of Midland Authors. He continues to teach literature and poetry at Denison University in Granville, Ohio, where he lives, and is currently editing an ongoing Eco-Poetics folio, Nature's Nature, at Kenyon Review. David, welcome back to Gramercy, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know everyone in our live and online audience will enjoy this conversation and enjoy Maggie's readings, and I thank all of you for joining us this evening. And now a warm welcome to Maggie Smith and David Baker.
I'm going to get up for a minute because I have a few minutes of things to say, and then I'm going to be quiet. I'm just going to read, but I thought if I have this thing to hold on to, it will be better that way.
That's not fair.
And I won't shake. How nice it is to be back in Gramercy Books. How nice to be anywhere. Masks and protocols and social distances, whatever it takes, right? It's going to take a little more. I appreciate Linda Cass and her colleagues and what they do for books and readers and community. And tonight, what they do for poetry. We're here to launch a new one into the world. In the scheme of things, it's a little deep, a book of poetry. And yet in the grand scheme of things, to use one of Maggie's titles, it means the world to sing and dance and wonder out loud with words. The goldenrod is a beautiful plant. Ready for this? It is, well, golden and tall and prolific. It is the common name, I love that, for several species of the sunflower family. Solidago nemorosus grows in Ohio, the old field goldenrod. So does Euthymia graminifolia, the grass-leafed goldenrod. But mainly in the fields and open meadows of Ohio, in the marshes and along riverbanks, you will find Solidago ohioensis. I'm not kidding. Ohio's own goldenrod. It has, says the Prairie Nursery Handbook, a compact form that belies its exuberant floral display. What a display, a whole field of them. They are so beautiful. And they are, according to many, rascals. They are weeds, the source of sneezing and watery eyes. And as Maggie's title poem reminds me, who loves the taxonomy and the names, they don't care what we call them. They're a weed. They are prolific. They are beautiful. They are in many ways toxic. They are very much like us. What is a weed? Asks Ralph Waldo Emerson in his lecture, The Fortune of the Republic, and answers himself in prose and yet in perfect iambic pentameter, a plant that doesn't fit the local plan. That's the heart of Maggie's poems. There was a plan, and we just don't fit. Maggie Smith's glorious new book of poems, Goldenrod, is taking root and spreading among readers of poetry. And this is especially remarkable of Maggie's work among many who are not typically readers of poetry. She is prolific. Her work is beautiful. And Maggie is native among us here in Ohio. Toxic? Weedy? Well, there are weedy ways in which her poems take root everywhere and dig down, as another wonderful Ohio poet once wrote, and break into blossom. Her poems are not elegant, they are not fanciful, they are not rare specimens suitable only for specialists or dusty museums. You get my point. So just a word about Maggie's background. Well, Linda told us some things. I won't repeat the titles of her books, which I brought along to show you. And my weatherproof field manual for environmental studies that is exactly the same size. The same color. I won't show you that. We won't talk about that. But get this, she's seen her poems featured on television's Madam Secretary and on radio's BBC and performed by the likes of Meryl Streep. Her poems have gone viral, they say. Let us say, they have gone goldenrod. Goldenrod is made of Maggie's strengths and also new blossoms, 54 poems that document the life of the family, the surprises of tenderness, but also rupture, ruin, and divorce, and always surprise. 54 poems in a $20 book. I did the math. 37 cents a poem. You hear me? You feel it? But the natural world abounds here too, the green world, and throughout the life of the mind of the maker. And here's Maggie Smith taking the temperature all along the way. So I'm going to shut up and just invite Maggie to read a couple of poems. And then perhaps I can ask a question. Does that sound okay?
That sounds perfect. Thank you. I thought you were going to say I was a rascal.
I didn't have to say it, did I?
No, my mother is not in the room, but she would agree. Once a rascal, always a rascal.
Yeah, we'll just go with weed.
Okay, fine, fine. Thank you. And thanks to Linda and the folks at Gramercy. Having this bookstore in my neighborhood in walking distance for myself and my kids is such a huge gift. So I'm really, really grateful that the only in-store event I get to do for this entire book tour is here. It feels right to me. I guess I'll start with the title poem, the rascal poem. This is Goldenrod. I'm no botanist. If you're the color of sulfur and growing at the roadside, you're goldenrod. You don't care what I call you, whatever you were born as. You don't know your own name. But driving near Peoria, the sky pink orange, the sun bobbing at the horizon, I see everything is what it is exactly, in spite of the words I use. Black cows, barns falling in on themselves, you, dear flowers born with a highway view. Forgive me if I've mistaken you, Goldenrod, whatever your name is, you are with your own kind. Look, the meadow is a mirror full of you, your reflection repeating. Whatever you are, I see you, wild yellow, and I would let you name me. All right, I'm just gonna read a few and then we'll chat.
Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking about this poem today, so I thought I would read it. It's was sort of inspired loosely the way many of my poems are inspired, which is by overhearing conversations between my kids. It's called Lacrimé. Green dashes for grassland, brown dots for desert, solid blue for water. The children's atlas is all simulacra from the Latin for likeness, which always reminds me of lacrimé, Latin for tears. That's the rickety bridge my brain makes over the river or the kinked blue line that stands for it. What a landscape in the symbolic distance, dark green lollipops for deciduous forest, a cluster of black carrots for mountains. Once, doing dishes, I overheard my children bickering about metaphysics in the next room. The 3-year-old said, "Everything is true." And his older sister countered, "Do you mean real?" When I think likeness, I think tears, blue, always for water, blue running through and under everything. They're pretty wise, those two. Sometimes they don't know how wise they are. David and I were just talking about this poem at dinner, so I thought I would read it. It's actually, I don't know that I've ever read this poem aloud except in the act of drafting, because I have to read poems aloud while I write so I can hear the cadence of it. So this is maybe my first time reading it other than to myself, muttering it at kitties while drafting or in my office. This is Perennials. Let us praise the ghost gardens of Gary, Detroit, Toledo, abandoned lots where perennials wake in competent dirt and frame the absence of a house. You can hear the sound of wind, which isn't wind at all, but leaves touching. Wind itself can't speak. It needs another to chime against, knock around. Again and again, the wind finds its tongue, but its tongue lives outside of its rusted mouth. Forget the wind. Let us instead praise meadow and ruin, weeds and wildflowers seeding years later. Let us praise the girl who lives in what they call a transitional neighborhood, another way of saying not dead or risen from it. Before running full speed through the sprinkler's arc, she tells her mother, who kneels in the garden, "Pretend I'm racing someone else. Pretend I'm winning." One more?
Sure.
I talked to the poet Dana Levin the other night about this book, and she called the poems God Curious, which sounded like an interesting phrase that one might put in a dating profile.
Yeah. And then not go, I wouldn't go
And
there.
then just
You'd be
not.
like, "Ah."
Yeah. And I think this is one of the poems that is God curious in the book. It's called Confession. My son's terrible fevers are softening me to God, to the idea. When he sizzles to the touch, speaks a strange new language of not consonants and not vowels, I need one golden iteration I can live with. When even syntax is burned black, smelling of creosote. By nightlight, I mitten his hands and sock his feet with cold washcloths. I wipe down his cheeks and forehead, his chest, and the back of his neck. He is nearly too big, but I lift him, hold him guitar slung across my body and sway. Now and then he whimpers, brain blazing. This is terror, and this must be how it happens, how need alchemizes into belief. I try to visualize being held myself in a cupped hand, in the shining idea of a hand. I try to feel myself held, holding. My arms tremble with his weight. Maybe I'll stop there.
Well, only for now.
Only for now, but I have it handy.
Yeah, I have some things I could ask you, and I hope people will be thinking of things to send into the chat to send up to me to ask some questions of Maggie in a minute. But I do have some things I could talk about if you'd like to. I'm so glad you read Perennials. That's one of my favorite poems in the book. And I wrote all this down. I have all this fancy stuff. I'm not going to look at it. The reason that I like Perennials so much is that it does this thing that I love in your poems that I've loved for a long time. And that is the attention to the human community, to the family, or that transition, that girl in the transitional neighborhood. I love that girl. I think the whole book is written to that girl. And that's a thing that I've gone to your poems forever. The rupture, the beauty, and the tenderness of the family. But there's a thing you're doing in this book that's also, it's not new, but you've pushed it forward. And that is the environmental landscape, the natural landscape, which also happens in perennials. A perennial, one of those weeds, one of those things that comes back. I think the phrase was in the ghost neighborhoods of Detroit and Akron, and there was Gary. Was it maybe?
Gary,
Yeah.
yeah.
Those rusty, nasty, wonderful cities in the Midwest where so many of us weeds live. And I wonder if you would talk about, or you thought, I know you thought, how you see that relationship between that green world, or the growing world, the weedy world, and the human world, and how those intersect in this book or in these poems.
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of us think about nature as something outside of ourselves.
Right.
I know you've probably thought about this a lot, like the nature poem. Like there's us and then there's nature, but that's not what it is at all, actually. We live in it. It's the air we breathe and the grass we walk across and the plants that we grow.
You could even say we are it.
We are it. Yeah, so I guess that sort of hierarchy, or the idea of sort of nature being the sort of elevated thing, and then the rest of us live, what, in the weeds? As we say, we're in the weeds.
Yeah.
I find myself in the weeds a lot. Part of what I think I'm trying to do in the poems, or perhaps not trying to do, but doing, which is how poems happen, right? If you try to do something in a poem, you fail. If you just do it, you might have half a shot at pulling it off. But I think part of what's happening in these poems is that kind of merging of what we think of as nature and the world that we live in, and it's not actually separate. Or trying to sort of break down that boundary, whatever that sort of invisible boundary is. I mean, seeing if you've seen these, like, I watched a documentary about Detroit, and I think they call them ghost gardens, and you can see whole blocks where the houses are gone, but all the gardens are standing in such a way that you can see the imprint, like the footprint of the house where it once stood, because whatever the person who lived there planted still comes up every year right on time, as if not realizing that the people no longer live there and the building's no longer there.
Plus all the other stuff.
Plus
The garden's
all the
doing
other
just
stuff.
what the garden wants to do.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that is a metaphor for, like, it seems like the Goldenrod and the title poem, sort of oblivious to us. Like we put the thing there, but after that, we're no longer necessary. It does its own thing on its own. And just sort of metaphorically, really kind of leaning into that and feeling weirdly comforted by it.
Mhm.
that there's stuff that's just going to happen without me knowing or doing anything about it, and that things just are, regardless of whether I know their names or not. They're themselves completely.
That's an interesting thing, and I think you're right. And it argues against Emerson, who I was holding up a
I'm not
bit
trying to
earlier.
argue against
Well,
it.
Emerson should be argued against.
Okay.
He says the poet is the namer.
Right, and that's the power of naming, right? I mean, that even goes back to the garden,
But-
right? If you're the power of naming.
But you're also
things.
talking about the remarkable humility of language, and that is the inability or the reluctance or the imperfectness of whatever we name a thing. It's not that. It's automatically not that.
Mm.
Goldenrod, there's a zillion. Why that? Why that thing? So I'll ask you a kind of question that I've studied this book a lot. I've thought a lot about this book.
Thank you.
And find a couple of surprising ancestors for this book. I want to see what you think about this.
Okay.
And it has to do with that weaving together of something like the interior household. I'm going to use the word the domestic, which has a long history of misogyny, of belittling. But I'm going to use it in the context of Emily Dickinson, who is the most ferocious, undomesticated lyric poet I know, as one of the parents of what you do. And the other, and this is the surprising one, this is the new one, John Clare, this fabulous 19th century, you know Clare, right?
I know Claire. I would not have thought of Claire as a father to my poem.
It's that I'm in the green world. I'm not separated from the green world. I don't know what it's doing. I love it. I will cultivate it. I will treat it as my child, and I will walk among it with a kind of glad innocence.
Mm.
I don't want to have to contain it. I want to just be with it. That's the Clare I love. And if there is a sort of two-parted influence, I don't know if it's influence, but ancestry to this book. To me, it's Dickinson and Clare, which is.
That's quite a set of parents.
Wouldn't you like to have dinner with him?
Yes.
Oh, one of
I
them wouldn't
think
talk
about
and the other one
childhood
wouldn't
family
stop.
dinners would have been quite different if I'd been with
But
Emily and John.
they're sort of I think the two great romantic poets of those, I guess, subjects or those inclinations that you're doing kind of seamlessly in this book. That's the thing that's so beautiful and surprising about this book. I have some little questions. How do you put a book like this together? What was the hardest poem in this book to write? How long did it take? What was hard about it?
Well, I sent you this book fairly early on
You did.
in manuscript stage, and I said, "What is happening?" And then it changed a bit from when I first sent it to you to this version. But really, it just came down to printing every poem since Good Bones came out. And not just
You mean
picking the
printing
ones,
out.
like
running-
literally
yeah.
printing them out, like going into my Word file of new poems. This is how disorganized I am. And realizing there were like 120 poems since I had published Good Bones, and printing them all out, and then chucking the ones aside I wasn't excited about, and then maybe having 80 that I felt really good about, and just deciding which ones want to be a book, because they don't all want to be they don't all want to play in the same yard. They're not all doing the same kinds of things. But for me, that's the real joy of putting a book together, because you don't write a book of poems like you write any other kind of book. And it's called a collection for a reason. I don't write a book of poems. I write one poem at a time over many years. And it's like painting very up close to a canvas, tiny, tiny, tiny movements. And then at the end, when I print everything out, I stand back and I see what I've made.
What do you see? what is the thing that you see that helps you determine what's going to be the book?
Well,
That's the question.
yeah, I think I tend to even deal with it on a more granular level than that, which is like, this poem seems to be talking to this poem, let them be together.
What does that mean?
This poem's, there's like either an echo imagistically or tonally, or they're asking the same question, but in different words. Like they're troubling over the same things. They share the same obsessions. And chances are, if you're writing something over the course of 5 years, they're going to.
So it's not subject matter, right?
No,
What
it's
is
not
it
really.
then if it's not subject matter?
I think for these poems, it's like there's something sort of like nagging in the soul of the speaker of these poems.
Yep.
That really ties them together. There's like a deep, deep not knowing that ties these poems together, and also a questioning, like, how do we even know what we know or what we think we know? And that kind of deeply questioning sensibility, I think, is what ties a lot of these poems together.
I think that's a fantastic answer, and I share.
Am I right?
There's no right. But
Because I might be wrong.
there's a thing I want to follow up, because it argues against some of the response to your poems.
That is true. It's really difficult. So writing a book of poems is very different from marketing a book of poems. And so whenever someone wants you to sell a book and market a book, or be interviewed about a book, or talk about a book on a radio or a podcast, the question is, what is the story of this book? And I don't have a good answer for that.
There's something even more than that. And this is what I'm asking you, because I would not know how to deal with this. Some of the really enthusiastic response that I honor to your work has to do with the lesson. That's a word that people use.
Ooh.
You know, they read the poem
I
and
think this
derive.
book pushes, it kind of eschews that.
That's what I want to know about.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think a lot of probably like the popular talk around my work is that it's accessible and hopeful and comforting.
Accessible, yeah, hopeful, in that music is hopeful.
Yeah.
The beautiful is hopeful.
And that it's okay not to know.
That's the thing.
It's okay not to know.
Because that argues against the turning of the poem into a kind of parable.
Yes, I agree. And it's odd for me to talk about poems in that way, because I don't, as a reader, and I'm the first person to say this in interviews, which tends to put the person kind of in a weird position, I don't go to poems for comfort.
Right.
I don't write them to comfort myself. You know, there's ice cream and Netflix. I don't read poems for comfort, because poems usually upset me in a beautiful way, in a good way. They agitate me. If I'm feeling smooth, the poem will find a splinter. And I go to poems for that. And I don't write poems to sand myself down. And so I don't think it's a comforting book.
That's what I felt reading the book too. And then some dissonance reading or listening to response to the book.
Yeah. I mean, if someone finds comfort in poems I find troubling,
good, that means they're looking for something.
they're looking for something. And honestly, I'm a little jealous. It's like people
Yeah.
who sleep at night. I'm curious about how that happens.
Yeah.
And how that is possible. And I am also in the chat, if you would like to share.
Yeah.
Sleep at night.
What's the formula, or what's the
I would
narcotic?
love to know, because I find that as a poet and a parent, that's not really something that I'm able to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like part of what I'm doing in poems, and I don't mean it in this sort of painful way, but it's almost like picking a scab. Like I'm trying to figure something out, and I'm asking myself, and I'm turning it this way, and I'm turning it this way, and I'm turning it this way. And I'm just seeking, and I'm curious.
That picking the scab thing is an interesting trope. That's Apollinaire, who says writing a poem is bruising the pain.
Yeah, but it feels good, you know, when you have a bruise and you keep poking it.
It feels
why
good,
do
or
you
at
do
least
that?
you're trying to figure out why it hurts, or where it hurts, or what is the
Where did that
nature
come
of that
from?
hurt. What's the language of that? I don't know. Harold Bloom says poems are about how to enlarge a solitary existence. That's what they're for. How to enlarge us, how to live a bigger life inside yourself among others.
That
That's-
is comforting though, isn't it?
It
Like if you read
is-
something and it makes you feel less alone, even if what you feel less alone in and that someone has articulated something for you that you haven't quite been able to sort of click into language
Yeah.
yet.
it's just
I know,
comfort.
I
don't know.
know.
But
I
yeah, it's about listening to the music of a soul. There's a thing it's a word I don't even traffic in.
Oh, but please, I've talked about that in this book. I don't know what to do with it.
But it's, when I say it, you conjure a thing, and it's pretty close to the thing I conjured.
Yeah.
So that it exists in some way, whatever that is. Why don't you read a poem?
Okay,
Would you
maybe
read
I'll
it?
read the poem
And
about
then
the
people
soul.
should be sending in some questions here pretty soon, and you
You know,
guys.
how about a light
Because
poem
we'll
about
just
the
talk
soul?
all night. We don't want that.
Something light about the soul.
Yeah.
Unanswerable
Oh, yeah,
questions.
that poem.
This poem.
Yeah, that poem.
So I'll say, there's a poem in, I'm not even going to remember. I think it's in The Well Speaks of Its Own Poison.
I happen to have that right
Do
here.
you? No, you don't. No, that's not the body. No, you don't have.
Oh, that's the one my student took it.
I think it's in The Well Speaks of His Own Poison, but it's a poem called White. And it's about the sound that your bones make that keep you company. They keep insomniacs company, the sound that the bones make. And so this poem sort of references a previous poem. So it's for the insiders.
We'll just call it meta.
Bones are the ultimate insiders, you know. That's a okay. This poem is called The Hum. It's not a question without the mark. How do we live with trust in a world that will continue to betray us? Hear my voice not lift at the end. How do we trust when we continue to be betrayed? For the first time, I doubt we'll find our way back. But how can we not? See how the terminal mark allows a question to dress as statement and vice versa. Sometimes if I am quiet and still, I can hear a small hum inside me, an appliance left running. Years ago, I thought it was coming from my bones. The hum kept me company, and I thought, thank God for bones, for the fidelity of bones. They'll be there until the end, and then some. Now what? How to continue? I've started calling the hum the soul. Today, I have to hold my breath to hear it. What question does it keep not asking and not asking, never changing its pitch? How do I answer? It's not a comforting poem.
It's not, but there's something really powerful and elegant about ending a poem on a question. That's a very difficult thing to do and not just throw up your hands. It's a beautiful ending.
Thank you.
I have this condition called tinnitus,
I have that too.
and it is
It
according
keeps me
to.
company.
I was going to say that according to like 15 of my doctors, it's just that the bone in my ear is talking to the passage of blood. I hate that.
Is it your right?
Yeah, well, it's both of them.
My left.
They sound like crickets. It goes all the time. So I got some questions for you that people have sent in.
I love that we've now disclosed our tinnitus.
This is a nice one. The beauty of poetry is that it calls the reader to interpret, to see what we see, which is not necessarily what the writer meant. Bingo.
Yeah.
As a cancer patient working towards survival, I see myself in a constant hallway looking for a doorway. Your poem Threshold offers me multiple doorways, imagining more than the hallway. What was your meaning or your thought behind the poem?
Yeah,
How
should we-
beautiful is
Should I
that?
read the poem?
Oh, yeah, you gotta read the poem.
And then I can talk about it a little.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful question. This is Threshold. You want a door you can be on both sides of at once. You want to be on both sides of here and there, now and then, together, and what do we call the life we would wish back if we could? The before? Alone. But any open space may be a threshold, an arch of entering and leaving, crossing a field, wading through nothing but Timothy grass. Imagine yourself passing from and into, passing through doorway after doorway after doorway. I mean, the poem began with that image. The
It
poem
did.
began with the image of the field and just seeing it as empty, but imagining that every time we move, every step we take, we're leaving a space behind us and entering a space in front of us. And how in that way, every time we take any step in any direction, it's sort of like there's an invisible doorway around us that we are constantly passing through. You know,
Do you see how easy you move, though, I want to say, in this poem, again, between this natural landscape of the field and the constructed landscape of a doorway of a house and the place where
Architecture.
people are.
Yeah,
Architecture.
yeah.
That's one of the really magical conceits of the whole book.
I mean, I think a lot of this book is about transitions and the sort of like tension between loss and openness. I don't know how to, if I'm
Well, that sounds
articulating
good.
that well, right? I mean,
Yeah.
just that like an empty space is also an open space. And when we call something empty, that has a negative connotation.
Right.
An empty room, but an open room is something different, like an open field, an open vista. It means the same thing. It's just,
But not.
it
Yeah.
doesn't.
This
It's
is
like
what
a
poets
tinge.
geek out on.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
oh my God.
Yeah.
The difference between empty and open.
Open.
Whoa.
Right.
No kidding.
And so much of it is like,
That's why they don't let us out.
no,
much.
they don't. That's why this is the only time I get to leave my house. It's to be with other word geeks. But yeah, that tension between emptiness and openness, I think, and it's really kind of the same tension as asking a question you have no answer for,
Yeah.
and just letting it hang in the room, and just sitting with it, you know, like living the questions and not needing to answer everything or being satisfied with the fact that the answer just doesn't exist.
That's it. I've spent a whole lot of my career in classrooms with 20-year-olds whom I love, but who are typically terrified by silence or something that, you know, telephone's not on, something's not beeping or ringing or
Yeah. Well, we live in everything all the time world right now.
that's it. Yeah.
And poetry is sort of like, in some ways, a really perfect antidote to that.
Well, the ideal of a poem is actually quiet.
Yeah.
And it's surrounded by quiet on all four sides, not just on one side like prose, but on all four sides. And we don't go to the end of the line to the right. We make some white space and we make stanzas, we make ruptures, we make caesura, we make these places where you can hear the bones in your ear hum, or you can hear something like the wind in that one poem, the wind in Gary, Indiana. So here's a question somebody, these are practical questions. What are some of the most influential writers for you? And how do you decide your poetry collection title? What comes first, the title or the title poem?
Oh,
That's a good one.
well, you know,
Yeah, I do.
because when I sent Secret Fact, or as my son says, Dark Fact, I have to tell this story. So my son wrote a little book about a trip we took to Chicago to see the Pitchfork Music Festival 2 summers ago, because why not take your kids to see, you know, a lot of bands, Bella Sebastian and Stereo Lab as their first show. And he wrote a little book, a little nonfiction book over at Montrose about the Chicago trip. And in the middle of the Chicago trip book, it just says in all caps, dark fact, the Chicago fire burned for 2 days. It has nothing to do with anything. It's like he just researched Chicago, dark fact.
Yeah. Whoa!
It's like dark fact, like
That's
colon.
so cool.
So I just feel like I need to have a poem now that just says dark fact and just like lists a bunch of terrible things. So here's not a dark fact, but a fact. When I sent the manuscript to you a couple of years ago in like, well, maybe a year ago in like short form, it wasn't quite done yet, but it was like, okay, I'm building a book. It was called Tender Age,
Right.
which is one of the, probably the longest poem in this book, and maybe one of the hardest poems in this book. And so when I eventually finished it and turned it in to my editor, she was like, no, I don't really like that title. What are some other options? And so when I'm titling any book, I always go through all of the poem titles first. I don't know how you do this, but I go through all of the poem titles in the TOC first, and I see which ones might be sort of metaphorically freighted enough to be representative of the book. So like there's a poem in Goldenrod called Walking the Dog. This book would never have been called Walking the Dog. I think Mary Oliver could have gotten away with that. I am not Mary Oliver.
No, we would bust her on that
We
too.
would bust her on that too. So it like, that didn't feel like it was enough. It was not telling enough about the whole book. And so I think at the end, it came down to Talisman, which is one of the poems, and Goldenrod. And I was like, I don't know if Goldenrod is really like metaphorically freighted enough to be the title.
That's
And
what
then-
I talked about.
I know, but so here's the thing. And then my editor came back and she's like, it's like a weed, but it's beautiful. And the scientific name Solidago means to make whole. And I was like, you damn it. Like, she speaks my language, you know? And I was like, okay, yeah, that actually works. It wouldn't have occurred to me naturally, like looking at all of the titles in the table of contents. But ultimately, it felt just right.
Cool.
So it's
What was
the
the
title
third of
always,
those? It was,
Talisman was the other
so
one.
listen to this. What do they have in common? Talisman, Tender Age, Goldenrod.
3 syllables.
They scan exactly the same.
Yeah. That's weird.
That's weird. What is that meter? Da da da. Is that an amphibrach?
It's a,
Strong, weak, strong. Da da da. Goldenrod, Talisman, strong, weak, strong.
yeah,
I think that's. What is that? Anybody know the Greek meter?
like you're asking, audience.
I think that's an amphimeter. I don't know. Yeah.
It's not an anapest,
No, it's not. I'll have to look that one up. That's cool.
not an anapest.
No, that's what it is. On purpose.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my last book of poems was Good Bones,
Right.
which was not the title.
That's a spondy.
That title of the book originally was Weep Up.
It was, I remember.
Yep,
But
and it got
then the
changed to
poem-
Good Bones, then the
Well.
poem. And so, but same syllable count,
Right.
same word count. So something about this really wanted to be.
3 syllables that started
But
with.
yeah, and
boom.
I don't begin poems with titles. Titles always last. And same with the book. Like I have to be able to know what to call the thing. I need to know what the thing is before I know what to call it. It's like naming, I didn't name my children before seeing their faces. I had like a short list, but I had to see their face before I knew
Yeah,
if it fit.
definitely not Fritz. That's not Fritz.
No, I just remember saying Violet and then being like, is that okay? I just named our kid without feedback. It's fine. Wait, what was the other question? I lost one.
There was one question
Who
about
do I read?
influential poets and writers. That like everybody?
Everyone.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I read as much as I can get my hands on, but also I guess maybe it's worth saying that a lot of the influence on my poems isn't poetry. It's like the nature documentary I watched about the
Right.
Yucatan with my son this morning, where I found that there's a bird that they call a clock bird because it has a tail that swings like a pendulum. And I wrote that down. And that all the rivers in the Yucatan are hidden. It's not that they don't have rivers, it's that they're all underground in a cave system. And that the tree roots go down into these.
Oh, that's just woo-woo.
Exactly. So, you know, I would have to say that, I mean, I read a lot of poetry. It's mostly what I read, but a lot of my inspiration for poems doesn't come from reading other people's poems. It comes from living
There you
and,
go.
you know, watching Nova and having conversations with my kids or walking around the neighborhood or listening to music or,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, just life.
I wonder if people here in the room with us have a question or something they'd like to ask Maggie.
You don't have to be
Because-
shy.
We've been just talking and talking, haven't we?
So I discovered your writing from hearing or reading Good Bones, like the famous poem. And I just wonder what it feels like to have something that you wrote at one time kind of like carry, even if you see your work going in like a different direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the question, I'll say it in case you couldn't hear it. The question is what does it feel like to have something that you wrote at a particular time sort of carry forward, even if your work sort of grows and changes in relation to
That
Good
is,
Bones?
it went goldenrod.
It went goldenrod.
Yeah, what's that like?
It went weeded out. It's really strange. I mean, I wrote that poem, like, I feel like guilty saying this in front of kiddies because now I work at Kitty's, but I wrote that poem at the Starbucks on the next block on a legal pad. So it's a really strange thing to have something that you don't really expect that many people to read because you're a poet and you expect the people to read your poems to be other poets. It's a
47 of them.
right, like all maybe 48 on a good day. Maybe somebody brings their significant other. It's, you know, poetry has like a pretty small but discerning audience. I love it that way. I wouldn't change it. But I think when I write, I'm not thinking very much about where the poem's going to go. And so with that poem, it was incredibly strange to have so many people read it and so many people who like weren't poetry people read it. And I was a little paralyzed, like right after the poem went viral, because I just thought, like, how can I write poems anymore? Because people are going to want that part too. People are going to expect me to write big idea poems about things, or now I'm like speaking, I'm like writing mom poems, or I'm speaking about, and I just didn't want to have to do that. So I guess to answer your question, it's really strange. And I think the best thing that we can do if something like that happens is pretend it didn't happen. And so I just pretended it didn't happen.
It's going to go on anyway.
It's gonna, yeah. And I mean, it's a little weird because I think, you know, that may be the one thing that outlives me. It may be like, that may be something that when I die gets to stick around. Maybe nothing else I ever write, but maybe that thing, and that's incredibly strange. But yeah, I mean, after that, I was like, I think I just need to write some poems about sticks and bombs and stones.
Yeah.
And so I actually, the poem Stone in this book was a poem I wrote right after Good Bones,
Yeah.
because I just needed to write poems about small concrete things and not give
Would
myself
you
a
read
job.
that one? That was one of the first ones that I think you had for the book, and it's one of the ones you were thinking about taking out.
This poem almost didn't make the cut because I
Yeah.
thought, can I really just put a poem about a rock in the book? But this was how I got over Good Bones, was writing poems about real things, like no ideas but things, right?
Yeah.
Stone. Anything the stone knows, it knows from experience. If the stone knows touch, it has the rain's cool lavishing of attention to thank. If it knows heat in my hand, sun-warmed, dry and smooth as a cheek, then light is where it can direct its gratitude. When I close my eyes, the lids glow. They're learning together to be stones. What does the stone know today that it didn't know yesterday or the day before? Violence, too, is a teacher. The rain drilling a pinhole, a tiny mouth in the stone, a tiny ear or eye over years, is a lesson in patience, but not only patience. The shoe scuffing it down the pavement is a lesson. The stone can be broken against its brother over and over until together they dazzle with fire.
Oh, that's a good ending.
Thank
Oh, that's a beautiful.
I almost cut that little guy, but it's kind of like white knuckled hanging on the edge of the cliff. Oh, don't! So we left him in. But I like having him in the book because having this poem in the book also gives me the opportunity to remember that, to remember
See,
what the first steps away from that capital P poem.
That's what I
were
like
for
about
me.
that poem. There's something just obdurate about it, blunt about it.
Yeah.
Is defying a kind of interpretive ease.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're going to run out of time here in a minute. So again, yes, that's what I'm asking.
I wanted to know, I read recently that Emily Dickinson, she wrote her first poems when she was young and wrote about 1,800 poems in her lifetime.
Yep.
And I often wonder, I wanted to ask you, how old were you when poetry first captured your heart? And who was the first poet, perhaps, or first poem that really touched you and made you want to become a poet?
I started writing poems before I started reading them, which seems ill-advised, right? It's like playing music without listening to music. You're like, I think I'm doing this thing. I started writing poems when I was 13, but I don't think I was really reading poems until high school. And the first poems I read, other than like the classic anthologized textbook poems by Frost and maybe Dickinson, and maybe Langston Hughes. I found a used bookstore. I grew up in Westerville, and I found a used bookstore in Westerville, and I still have these old volumes. I found some Donald Hall. One of the first poets I read was Donald Hall, which is interesting now thinking about like white galoshes and the taste of stone. Donald Hall, Marge Piercy, Nikki Giovanni, Rita Dove, and then I moved quickly into Plath and Sexton, where I remained encamped for several years and wrote what I call Plath cover poems. Because when you're like 16, 17 and feeling angst and reading a lot of Plath, it's just like if you're 16, 17 and listening to a lot of Zeppelin, like everything you're gonna play on your guitar is gonna sound like that until it doesn't. And so I think those were the first poems, but really I started writing, I think, more based on music than on poetry, because my parents had a really extensive record collection and I got really obsessed with music at a young age. And so I would listen to my parents like Beatles records and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And if I didn't have the lyrics handy, I would listen over and over and try to write them down and listen to the language and try to get these sort of like crystallized images. And they weren't doing with words what like the books I was reading were doing with words. Like there was no plot, nobody said something to somebody else and then went and did something, which I still don't know how, I don't know how people do that.
Yeah.
Like, how do you get people from a gas station having a conversation to another location, having a conversation?
Beam them over.
I don't understand. I only know how to juxtapose images. I can't make, or I shouldn't say I can't. I haven't yet made things happen with people in my writing. And it seems very magical to me. But somehow listening to songwriting made the kind of like metaphor and image that I started doing in poetry possible. And of course they all rhymed in the beginning because they're supposed to.
I'm going to say two quick things here. We'll take one more question. So we'll take your question. Yeah, in just a second. And I will add that Elliot Bush has written in about that meter that we were talking about.
Oh, no, somebody knows.
Yeah. Well, it turns out we were right. It was the
no, we weren't right.
amphimeter.
Right. Okay.
The da-da-da. Thank you, Elliot Bush. So we will take one more question for Maggie, and then Linda will come up and send us on our way.
So one way you really impacted a deeper level of curiosity in me, and I find it so rewarding. And so my question to you is, what motivates you to stay curious but dig deep into that curiosity where you're, you know, poking that bruise? What's propelling that for you?
I think that's the rascal. I think that's that rascally part of me that doesn't know how not to do it. I mean, I think if I were a different kind of person, I probably wouldn't have become a writer. If I were a less curious person, I probably wouldn't do what I do. I probably would sleep better, if I'm being frank. I wouldn't advise it really as a way to live a peaceful life, to be relentlessly curious and questioning. So I can't say that there's something that motivates me. I just don't know any other way to be. I probably, I mean, if I asked my mom, I probably was like that as a kid. Like the kid who's always like, yeah, but why? You know, there's a reason why parents say because I said so. There's children like me who ask why, yeah, but why? But why do we have to do this? But what about this? But what about this? And I think, you know, I think as kids, we all have that. And some of us are more easily placated than others. And, you know, I taught poetry briefly to some kids at Montrose, just a couple blocks away. And their textbook said that poets have special eyes. They sent me the curriculum ahead of time so that I could teach against it. They sent me the curriculum and it said like poets have special eyes and they see things differently from other people. And so they actually suggested that the teacher would decorate like a pair of like big comic glasses with like flowers and stuff to put on their poet's eyes for the poetry lesson. I was horrified. And so I went in on the first day and I was like, newsflash, friends, third graders, poets do not have special eyes. In fact, you were born with them. The eyes you have in your head are poet's eyes. And even if you were not a sighted person, you would still have poet's eyes. It's just a way of sort of being in the world and being curious. And I think a lot of us let it be scrubbed out of us. You know, work does that. And unfortunately, like being a grown-up sometimes does that to us. And so I think I have like stubbornly remained immature in a lot of ways over the course of my life. I mean, I do most things that grown-ups do.
You're looking at me, I'm not gonna.
You're not gonna help me out, but I just think like maintaining that sort of childlike wonder and curiosity as much as possible. That's sort of been the thing that's kept my writing going. I mean, once you know, knowing is a death. Like once you're like, what's the answer to this question? And somebody answers it for you, it might be like satisfying, but it's also like, oh, it's not magic. There's a reason why lightning bugs light up. That's not, oh. I try to keep knowledge at bay as much as possible. Just I don't want to know. I actually I would much rather wonder about things than know. Which as a parent is a precarious position to be in because they look at you like you're supposed to know things. And my answer is always like, I don't know, what do you think? That's not comforting. But yeah, I think just keeping that alive, being really comfortable not knowing, which is an uncomfortable, you know, we're all supposed to be experts at things. We're all trying to gain knowledge and become competent. What would happen if we just shrugged and let ourselves sort of think a little bit more and know a little bit less? And not out of laziness, but just out of like embracing what might be possible. I don't know.
That's beautiful.
Well, I must say, for people who wonder why we're called Gramercy books, it's taken from the French word big thanks. And that's really what I want to start here and say. Big thanks for both of you for what you give to us in your work and for this evening. A fabulous conversation. Wish it could go on for many hours. Thank you to this audience, live audience here tonight. who came out and joined. I know it's very special to get back together, and we will continue to do that. I think this is a safe space. We can wear masks and still be together here for author events. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know all of you here have gotten Maggie's book. If you want to get one for a gift, consider that. What a wonderful gift to a dear friend. And for our online audience, we've added a link in the chat box if you'd like to purchase a copy if you haven't. We've also a link in the chat box for David's last collection, Swift, New and Selected Poems. I also want to remind the online audience of the links in our chat box for the next 3 author programs. I know there was a little bit of audio issue, so take a look at those links and click in and learn more about those events. As a reminder to our in-person audience who, feel free to stay and browse, and Maggie and David will be autographing their copies at our book signing table. We all want to do our part to eradicate this virus. So if you don't have your mask on now or with you, we do have a box up front. I think for the book signing portion, I'd really love you to just put your mask on and everyone can be comfortable with that. We're open 7 days a week, 10 to 6. Keep visiting, and we have curbside pickup too. So just thanks everyone for joining us here and online, and have a great evening.